Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's just us, and we're not at the PCA General Assembly in Chattanooga, Tennessee. In fact, we haven't been there for weeks. But you wouldn't know that because over these last few weeks, all we've had are our interviews. Anyway, maybe this all sounds strange and you don't have a way to interpret what I'm talking about because this is the first time here for you. Let us introduce ourselves just in case you don't know who we are. I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, right outside Portland, Oregon, and I'm also a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Okay, enough about me. How about you, Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a retired history professor specializing in Renaissance and Reformation Europe. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I work as well for Reflections Ministries under Ken Boa, and I have my own 501c3 called Every Square Inch Ministries at esquareinch.org.
Tom, why don't you introduce yourself and then take us into the subject of the day since it's your show.
Okay, I'm Tom Price. I'm a theologian and Christian ethicist. I teach both at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary and a few other places. Also involved in some ministry work. But the topic today is about something that touches on sort of theology and ethics. And it goes back to an event that was sort of a watershed moment. We've discussed it before and these themes before, but I want to bring out a few differing aspects, and hopefully this article that we're engaging today will help us do it. So maybe I should begin with the article. It's called Eugenics and the Approval of Birth Control in the 1930 Lambeth Conference by a historian at the University of Oxford, Andrew Moeller. So
before you go any further, Tom, that is explosive because none of the people behind birth control want that association to be made.
That's right. That is, I mean, just from the I think the start with the title, that's what drew me to it as well, as I was doing some research in bioethics on the issue of the kind of changing milieu in which the birth control shift happened within Christian circles. And that theme kept showing up over and over again. It was actually, I was at a lecture at the Blake Center here in Connecticut a couple weeks ago where a historian was lecturing on the Scopes trial. And he brought up the fact of how many Christians had sort of absorbed and liked some of the ideas of the eugenics that were going on in it, even though they didn't love the Darwinian grounding and implications. Right. So it definitely kind of stirred some of my research interests after that. So I guess one of the things to begin with is just kind of what is Lambeth Conference, or what is it up to? Who does it, and why is it important? And
so this was already notorious, and now it's going to be even more notorious.
It's going to be more notorious. Yeah, we're going to stir the pot a little, and the fact that it is so linked to even Protestant consequences and evangelical in particular, it's really going to stir some things, definitely. So the Lambeth Conference is within the Church of England, what goes by sort of the Anglican church in England, has a meeting annually of its bishops where they go and talk about, discuss, and really vote on the direction of the church in regards to things like moral matters, doctrinal ones as well. And just to kind of keep this theme at the center of it about birth control, all the way up until 1930, for the most part, the Church of England and its bishops were, number one, very committed to the classic faith that a Roman Catholic would hold, or an Orthodox Christian, or an evangelical Christian, or any other Orthodox Christian would hold, very much holding to the fact that human sexuality is to be governed and bounded by the marital context, and that the procreative, the having of children, is to be a big center part of that marital relationship and part of its purposes, key purposes, even if not ultimate purpose. And so marriage and children, even though not everyone who was married could have children, it still was something that should be an open possibility for everyone married, and that outside of the marital context, it was a no-no, first and foremost, because of the unnatural way in which procreation would start to have to, children being born into the world would have to deal with a broken outside structure. And also there were a lot of social ramifications. But it wasn't just the social consequences and the practical consequences. This was something grounded in reality. And that is why there are social consequences and there are other consequences when this gets disrupted and broke. So classically, the Church of England fought very hard when science started to develop and culture started to move in a direction where the possibility for disrupting the procreative dimension of human relationships was now something that people were willing to do in their own lives, and science could help them do if they wanted to. In other words, birth control could enter into the world and do a lot of damage to what had previously been a bounded context for marriage, family, and social life.
Yeah. Now, it's worth noting a couple of things at this point. First of all, contraception goes way back. I mean, the Romans had various forms of contraception, as did probably pretty much everyone else. It becomes an issue in this period. Now, this is prior to the pill. Okay, we're decades before the pill's invented. But it becomes an issue in this period in part because of the massive disruptions that are caused by the First World War. You start seeing the really big push, and I mean, it starts earlier. You've got things in Victorian England, some extreme clubs and things like that are pushing these kinds of ideas, at least internally. But it becomes more of a live issue really after the war. And there are a couple of reasons for that, I suspect. One of them is the lost generation, the entire the absolute destruction in a lot of ways of a generation of young men, either through death, wounding, or PTSD. That creates an imbalance. It becomes more difficult. Marriage becomes more difficult because there simply aren't enough men for the women. This is going to, and then there's also the disillusionment that's caused by the war with society, with the Western tradition, with all of those kinds of things. On an intellectual level, you certainly see that, but I think you also see it at a popular level. So all of these things are feeding into the idea that where we've been is wrong, it's repressive, it leads to things like the war, all of these kinds of things, and we just need to chuck it out and get with the modern world and do something different.
Yeah, it's also interesting to note that, I don't know if you saw here recently, Nancy Pearcey posted an extended quote from Aldous Huxley about what was sort of the personal motivation for some of his writing. It had to do with basically his own desire to drain the world of meaning so he could essentially just satisfy his sexually perverse drives or needs, or whatever you want to call it. Anyway, so and that was published in 1932. So this is an interesting coincidence. It's same period of time. There's something going on in Western culture. I think about, say, Chesterton and his war against the eugenicists intellectually. That happened a little earlier, but there's also a kind of impulse to leave behind the metaphysics of Christianity and the implications that the created order that we live in it has provided us with, some standards, and it's meaningful, and consequently we need to rise up and fulfill our obligations to each other as men and women, etc. And outside of that framework, you have a lot of intellectuals who are really working to promote a different way of thinking about the natural world. And we can go back to Hume and the is-ought distinction and all that. But I think it's what I'm getting at is that there's something that's been developing for a while.
Yes,
a different way of thinking about the physical world, cut off from its metaphysical sources.
And that,
if you think about one final historical comment, if you think about it in terms of our own history, this is the Roaring '20s that are leading up to this.
Yeah, right.
Which is I talked about it more in terms of despair, which I think is probably more true in Europe, but it's also a time of some sort of exuberance about an idea of freedom, but a freedom from restraint.
Well, that's the thing, is this notion of freedom has been growing for a long time, and it has a long history. And it started out in a balanced way, introduced by the Christian faith in particular. We weren't stuck in this cosmic cycle and circle, that there is a genuine gift of freedom that is premised. That means it has conditions and boundaries, but there is a genuine freedom we have as Christians to be in relation with each other and enact ourselves in the world and upon it. When that gets ripped from the theological context, and that's sort of what we're talking about here, and that freedom gets to run unbounded, Prometheus, if you will, the Prometheus unbounded, and then, which leads to Icarus building the artificial wings to fly to heights, gets burned, crashes to the sea. That's sort of the world wars we're talking about. What we end up with is that created order grid that still may be stamped in the kind of key assumptions of a lot of Western culture is starting to erode and eradicate. And you're right, Chris, there were deliberate moves in the intellectual world to free us from all that. As a matter of fact, they saw the part of the problem was the way in which Christianity reinforced, kind of an illegitimate form of that onto the material world. And so science and technology becomes a vehicle for being able to dislodge that. And then you also have, interestingly, back to the article, one of the things it says right at the beginning is these reports elucidate the theological and moral reasoning underpinning the resolutions. And it's as you start to get to them, there is this line that I don't know if it was the Bishop Theodore Wood, who we'll get to in a little while, but one of the things that they were recognizing just between 1920 and 1930, where this shift took place, and you're right, Glenn, here, the Roaring '20s, but a lot of this after the war, not taking things seriously and kind of indulging, right? They took advantage of this, but he talked about the sea change where, just like, I love this quote, just like Christian doctrine, now Christian morality is being disowned and repudiated culturally. And we know this happens. We understand why. But they were at the moment where it was starting to have consequence. And so what we're talking about, and what Chris was mentioning, is the fact that Christian doctrine defined and helped elucidate the created moral order. And it gave us sight into something that for years the Christian faith was able to cultivate and develop a rich vision of, which is now being increasingly and purposefully dismantled for new conceptions of the human and new conceptions of freedom.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that's important to talk about, that I think we can be helpful with many of our listeners who maybe come from low church traditions where essentially it's they've had a populist version of Christianity and they don't have much knowledge about the intellectual roots of some of the things that they've wondered about and been concerned about. Often people will say, it was the 1960s, when prayer was made illegal in public schools and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Then they say that's where all the problems began. Well, I'm not trying to downplay the significance of prayer. What I think people ought to consider is, how did he even get to a place where that could happen? In other words, there's a long history that came before that prepared the ground intellectually for that to occur.
I blame Rousseau.
That's right. Well, it's funny. It's speaking of the French Revolution, it just brought to mind, there was a communist official. I can't remember who it was, and he was asked, "What do you think about the French Revolution?" And he said, "Well, we'll see how it plays out." In other words, it isn't over yet. And in his mind, the history of the world ever since that time is basically playing out the implications of the French Revolution.
I believe that was Zhou Enlai.
Okay,
China.
I'll
Too soon to tell was his answer.
Well, that's sort of how we start to approach our experimentation starts to do that too. It says we don't know in advance; we'll find out through the making.
Right.
But one of the things you're right. This has been a long process, and it is probably worth introducing at this moment because this is where it's starting to catch up to that last place where Christians wanted it to end up, the moral contribution of Christianity to culture. But as we've talked about a long time, is that this had been being undermined on the doctrinal and therefore on the metaphysical level for a long time. And so Christians, whether they knew it or not, have been habituating their own Christianity through forms of thought less indebted to the full vision of Christianity to a subvision, which leads us almost in a readiness to embrace this. I'll give you an example. I was doing recently some research on the understanding of nature within predominantly Protestant-oriented cultures after its break with Catholicism. Scotland, Presbyterian and Reformed as you can get, where Reformed scholasticism, of all things, took a strong root in the universities. But I just read a dissertation, is fabulous, he looked at all the master's and educational theses that were being written in the Scottish universities. And he traces the embrace increasingly of, Duns Scotus vision of metaphysics. I don't need to get into that today. But the increasing change in the understanding of physics and nature. They started to adopt a lot of the ideas coming out of humanism in particular. He traces this whole morphing of its understanding of nature to almost parallel what will ready it for figures like Francis Bacon, and of course, leading up to a very different view of our relationship to nature and our understanding of it. So this has been going on, and it's not just Protestants. Catholics have their own form of it. I mean, the whole tradition of casuistry and ethics is because of their own embrace of a shift, and they've had to do retrieval work to get back a hold of a rich doctrine of nature and creation. So this right here is really the outflow of a long process, and it's something we're really, especially in the evangelical world, just becoming conscious of because we're seeing a lot of the nihilistic consequences of this shift. So one of the things, though, we see here is they talk about in their documents, the Lambeth Conference of 1930, where they first started to loosen their grip on contraceptive and birth control in some measure, in a very conservative way, but still that little shift opened up Pandora's box. But one of the things in this sea change is to notice they talk about their fear of the process of secularization, which means the church is starting to lose its moral say in society and its place as an authority, and they're worried about it, and they don't know what to do with it. Secondly, they talk about the increasing, like Glenn was talking about, hedonism, and Chris too, and the increasing materialistic philosophy that is impacting and becoming a competitor. And they put it this way, a credible competitor to what had classically been held as a Christian understanding of reality. So society was, for a host of reasons, starting to change its attitudes and had been more consciously aware of where they were now different than the church, and their morality was starting to express itself as seeing the church as outdated, outmoded, or out of touch. And so this becomes one of the worries that the Lambeth Conference in 1930 is trying to address. And so on one level, they talk about the fact, well, if we just give a little step and say, you know what, maybe we can preserve the good and have moral authority on the good of marriage, family, and its impact on society by saying, okay, maybe the use of birth control within that marital context to appreciate intimacy within marriage and that there are more ends than just the procreative in marriage, that will be an okay thing.
Yeah, and even there, it was under only limited circumstances.
That's right. And it wasn't for people like they do today. Well, we're not ready to have kids because we want to travel the world. That was not something that Lambeth 1930 would have thought to be good.
But here's the thing. This is the containment problem. So we have, with artificial intelligence, we have a new way of talking about the slippery slope. We could call it the containment problem. Basically, this sort of concession, this admittedly small one, created enough space for a contagious sort of spread of ideas opening. It was an opening. And now we're in a situation where, it would be completely unrecognizable to people that if we were able to go back in time and bring with us photographs and say, in less than 100 years, this is what your church will look like, and just show them the rainbows and the goofiness and the sprinkle, liturgies and sparkle liturgies and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And they would just not be able to. They would obviously call us liars. But that's it. There's this line of connection that's undeniable now.
Yeah. Well, another thing though that is worth noting, we're going after the Anglicans here because of Lambeth, but the fact of the matter is, every major Protestant denomination held that contraception was sin.
Right.
Every one of them.
Yep.
One of the side effects of Lambeth is once they do this, it puts pressure on the other denominations to make similar accommodations, and pretty soon it's a race to the bottom.
Right.
And they all ran with it. I mean, even your evangelical world, it's 1968, Christianity Today, the new evangelicalism. On the one hand, promoting as a competitor to the increased world of the sexual revolution, on how wonderful and superior marital life is, especially for the pleasures of human intimacy and sexuality, places the okay stamp and a moral good on contraception. It moves from just a kind of possibility of maybe something to make a moral decision with because of some maybe legitimate moral reason, to this is a positive good. So you have an embrace.
It's even worse, Tom. We know if you just go back and look at the old issues that they were also endorsing abortion.
Right.
Yeah. There was it wasn't until Francis Schaeffer came and blew the whistle and led a counter charge, sounded the bugle or whatever, and led a counter charge but nobody it seems like we suffer from amnesia now.
Well, and that a lot of that comes from the kind of biblicism that was part and parcel of the evangelical world. Give me a verse that says, "Thou shalt not abort thy child." Give me a verse that says, "Thou shalt not use contraception."
Right.
You don't have anything that says that explicitly, in terms of a straightforward command in Scripture, and therefore, since you can't point me to chapter and verse, it's perfectly fine.
Yeah, there's no, they did, again, and there were other, and Catholics, to their credit, in many cases led the way, especially on the retrieval of the doctrine of creation, and didn't sway whether or not they were consistent or not. They led the way, and it wasn't until later that a lot of Protestants said, oh, wait a minute. Now we see theologically what's going on here. We too need to start addressing.
But this brings up another feature to this. Abortion and contraception were considered to be Catholic issues. We're Protestants. We don't have to worry about those things, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you get that.
There are a lot of. I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, even you read Peter Harrison's work on Protestantism, the Bible, and science, and even if you don't agree with all of it, I think as a historian, he's so perceptive of the kind of biblicism that led not only to an increased secularity and a way of flattening the world the way we've read it, basically gutting it of any participation in a created order, but readying us for this pragmatic utilitarianism that almost makes us jump with every technology standing before creation in wonder and being ready to run with it and embrace it. And we'll do this. The created order it only becomes significant if it can be about our moral or self-driven purposes. I mean,
moral understood in a very, very narrow sense.
In individualist sense, it is, and you're seeing this with what's going on in Lambeth in 1930, and they even say, actually, this is interesting because you can see the creeping in of almost secular, naturalistic set of assumptions about creation when they start to use their own pragmatic reasoning at Lambeth. They basically start arguing on the same worldview terms as the secular society around them and assuming their view of things. But one of the things that they mentioned at first, even in the 1930s, is that what you're dealing with contraceptive is, quote unquote, an unnatural disruption of a purpose, ingredient in human nature, stamped on it, a created order. And so this is one of those places where we can learn something. We're not just talking on the biological level, though it's apparent right there, right? We're talking natural order towards life. And it's not simply just a functioning practical system. It's oriented to this. This is why you can do something to disrupt it, but it's an artificial thing that has to enter into it to disrupt it. You have to think of what it's called: contraception.
Right.
Against conceiving. Conceiving is the naturally oriented order here, whether or not it functions always perfectly in a broken world or not. That's what's normal. You have to oppose it. It has to be a contra. You have to disrupt this teleology for some other, what they're claiming, at least evangelicals later, is a equally moral good,
right?
Yeah, and on the same level, and so it's surprising. But think of the other language there. You got family planning, you have birth control. The very language that is getting adopted is that shift away from created order and its purposes to control over, dominance over the natural and the natural teleological. Now we have to contra accept this.
This brings up something that I noted publicly here not too long ago, that when we use the word creationist in our circles, that is usually used to designate people who are strict, 6-day creation, 24-hour people. But outside of the church, creationist actually includes anybody that believes that there is a creator and that nature has purposes. Yeah. And one of the problems that we have in evangelicalism is that we're fighting a fight that fails to acknowledge the real field of conflict. In other words, where the conflict is actually occurring. So where the conflict is occurring is in fields that particularly in the world of technology, which don't want to have to be burdened by or constrained by any sense of that the created world has a purpose or has purposes in it. So we think about something like transgenderism. People are willing to entertain the possibility that, well, it's just not physically healthy to undergo these treatments, but they're not willing to go to the next step and say, there is a implicit moral order that exists that is being defied, and this is the kind of creationism that people in the the larger society want to deny or jettison, and we have some kind of weird people who seem to be okay with it, even in the church, who really do kind of treat the world as though it's Play-Doh, and we can make it into anything we want.
Yeah, they've sanctified the conception of the human being as having their dignity found in their freedom to even be free from those natural gifts and givens. I mean, so for them, the real core of you is that transcendent aspect of you that gets to self-define and self-determine. It's not the rest of it. The rest of it is just stuff that you're kind of stuck in for the here and now, or you get to play with because you've been given the dignity of a subjectivity. You've been given agency, and your God-given right as is to be able to use that agency however you see fit. That is how they've followed the kind of secular modernist interpretation, and then they've sanctified it. That's where you're being made in the image of God sits. And so because of that, you as a lord over your own self and whatever else your interests are, get to create reality out of your own constructions and out of your own wants and wishes, and use your intelligence and everything else to do it. And nobody should have any right to place a boundary on it unless you, quote unquote, hurt someone else, right? And so so for us to say, well, wait a minute, that's a boundary you can't go over. I can't go over. It's not drawn by us. We haven't been given. It's the fruit that we're not allowed to eat, right? It's right. That tree was not given to us for that, right?
Right.
They see that as, us trying to impose an idea on them that doesn't match what the idea that they have. And here is where I think, the whole story gets thick. Because you're dealing with a world in which ideas and reality have been severed from each other. That's where you get your my ideas now are imposed on raw material, or there is nothing out there in reality. I'm the one who imposes the meaning onto it. Because those things have been severed, and now they've been read so that we're the suppliers of any meaning or good onto reality. Well, we're in a situation where what happens at Lambeth, when we've been given the okay to say, well, this is a temporary moral good for me and my family to allow for technology to interfere with natural gifts and givens, maybe there's more parameter that I get to do that with as well. And maybe I get to do that with everything, my own human sexuality, my own orientation.
We can't make these small concessions to sort of a modernist way of thinking without inviting a whole host of things that we're not intending to welcome.
Yeah.
So my conviction is that we need to kind of build out and be more comprehensive in our work when it comes to not just evangelism, but discipleship and so forth, helping people see the world really in a new way. Like when I think about, the way evangelism, particularly mass evangelism, was conducted in, say, the late 19th and 20th centuries, there was a kind of decisionism that more or less assumes tacitly, that we live in a culture where people know right and wrong, and the thing that needs to be addressed is personal salvation, and we can more or less, believe, trust that people are going to get a lot of things right because the culture is more or less kind of structured along, Christian lines. But in the early church, they didn't have that freedom. They didn't have that ability to just sort of take things for granted. And there was a very intentional and deliberate and long-term process of Christian formation that was so a convert. It was expected it was going to take a while for a convert to get it. Now we just don't think in those terms. Maybe we think about, well, you'll have this worldview class and maybe a discipleship book that you go through with somebody and you're good.
Yeah, and liturgically, it's important to remember that for quite a long time in the early church, converts were not admitted to the entire service.
Right.
They were admitted to the first part, then they were escorted out for the Eucharist. That was only for people who had been educated and gone through the process. So this was part and parcel of the way the early church operated.
And the catechesis, I think, is one of the proper understanding of Christian catechesis and the way it was practiced, especially in environments like that, are one of the keys, I think, in the formative dimension that we can be drawn to help us in this regard. And I think this is what gets slimmed down. for example, even at Lambeth, you probably had your standards of catechism and liturgical understanding. But you can already notice in what he said is, in this, he said the doctrine has already been disbelieved by the society. But it wasn't just the society, it was large chunks of the church that had stopped believing in the doctrine. You had the erosion through doctrinal criticism and biblical criticisms of most doctrines as basically kind of the expression of Christian experience across the ages. When it's not, you're not dealing with reality. So what do you have? You've been underfed on the level of being able to see reality in the full way. So of course you can't see nature's kinds, created order, or the rest of it. You're not formed to see it. Discipleship is about being formed to see, weaned from your idols, purified loves, clarity of vision. I mean, this goes right back. I mean, you see it over and over again. This starts to get lost, and then it becomes, if you notice, even in this article, the emphasis keeps becoming, well, if we do this, there are going to be practical consequences socially that are going to be harmful, and we can't have that. That's good, but that's not going to compel a hedonist to do anything. There's no engagement on the level of reality going on here. It's the level of moral consequence or social consequence. And then this is where it gets interesting. So the practical utility taking over of the theological argument here becomes one of the concerns of Theodore Wood, who is proposing and selling, and very convincingly, this notion of birth control, because this is a little bit ironic, because he thinks that it will help them in their goal of getting the middle and upper classes to produce more healthy stock for the continued vibrancy of English and European culture. And what isn't said is, how does birth control help in that manner?
That's right.
Well, actually there is a rather strange line of reasoning here.
Yeah.
The church has lost its moral authority. People no longer believe in the moral authority of the church. Yeah. If we throw them a bone and say that contraception is okay under certain circumstances, and what's really important here is your motive, much more than the actual practice.
Subjective.
If we do that, people will look at this and say, "Oh, that makes sense. They're being reasonable. This is good," and it will restore the church's moral authority so that they can then
promote
what other things at the Lambeth Conference did was talk about the importance of marriage and children.
Yes, and they did.
So if we recapture our moral authority here, people will listen to that.
Here.
It was a fool's errand, but that's what they were trying to do.
And one does wonder, it's not said, and I'm not making the claim, but it makes you wonder also about their concerns on other ends, like we had in the US with our embrace of it, is that there are stocks that we don't really want to continue because they harm society. And if we open the door in some cases, especially some of their reasoning is the socioeconomic issues and the burden on the mothers. Well, most mothers aren't going to have that burden in these middle to upper class areas. So who are they talking about? Lower classes, Irish. I mean, who? And again, I'm not saying that was here, but that's why I think the article is leaving that as open.
But we are talking about Englishmen here who have the gift of understatement and the ability to say things without saying them.
Yeah.
So
I do like, though, how they said that we were dealing definitely with a wicked culture because people only want to have 2 or 3 kids.
That's a beautiful statement. I'd like to step back a little bit and just think about the nature of decadence. So, because the 1920s, if we think about Weimar Germany, it was notorious for its decadent character. You're dealing with a defeated nation and a lot of disillusioned people. But I think across the board, even in the victorious countries, as you noted, Glenn, there was a sense that, our sort of our legitimacy and our purpose had been undermined by this war. And I think about Jacques Barzun and his understanding of decadence. Dawn to Decadence is a great book. I really got a lot out of that. But he introduced the kind of an insight to me about decadence that I had never entertained, and it was basically that decadence is what happens when you've lost faith. When you've lost faith in the sort of the overriding purpose of your civilization. And so what you do is you kind of dial it back, you kind of invest yourself in, the pleasures that you can satisfy because you no longer are willing to make the sacrifices that are called for to serve the larger sort of civilizational purpose or vision. And it often happens, when you're at a fairly comfortable place. But following the 1920s, it's interesting. This occurred in 1930, the Lambeth Conference. We know in 1929 there was a little event in the stock market.
Yeah,
and I think that what we've seen over the last 200 years or since the French Revolution is a series of fits and starts where the implications of the new way of thinking, the modern way of thinking, they are unleashed, and then there's some disaster that occurs socially, even environmentally, that causes us to kind of pull back and recover some of the virtues of our ancestors and a willingness to sacrifice. So I think when you talk to people from the greatest generation about their childhoods, they'll talk about the Depression. They'll talk about the sacrifices made in World War II. There was still enough sort of cultural, stock, meaning legitimacy, when it came to the life and the purposes of our civilization, that when the chips were down, people rose and made sacrifices. They did the things that they had to do. Now, some of it you say, well, they just had to survive. There's that. With regard to the Dust Bowl years or whatever. But there's also, I think, the fact that a lot of the folks, that we associate with, the greatest generation, were pretty patriotic and pious even. I mean, even people who were not pious gave lip service to piety in those days. And that's why the 1950s was like this heyday for like mainline Protestantism, at least in the United States. Churches were packed. But if you would take people from the 1920s who were just kind of, the Great Gatsby types and, take them forward 30 years to the 1950s, they probably wouldn't be able to understand how it happened. But, a depression and a world war can do that.
What's interesting, this is something that I've observed, in history. Whenever there's a significant amount of stress in society, there has been a call to return to traditional values, whether or not the problem is traditional values. There's always the sense that something's gone wrong. We need to go back. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there are a few exceptions, the French Revolution being a great one. But we've seen this in America as recently as Reagan.
Yeah.
I remember Reagan basically calling us to return to the things that made America great in the first place, to traditional values and so on. We don't see that anymore. And I find it rather interesting that what we're not seeing, we're seeing a call to return to the Constitution maybe, but that's about it. And I think the reason is that in the Reagan era, there was still enough cultural capital,
right,
that people remembered, and you could make that call, and people would accept it. I think that the cultural capital has eroded to the point, particularly through the indoctrination people have gotten through education. I think the cultural capital has eroded to the point that there's no longer any desire to return.
Yeah,
constitutionally, because we want limited government or whatever, but the other parts of the society, not so much.
There's been so much libel of the dead, and hardly anybody making a case for their virtues, and that people don't associate any virtue with the past anymore.
And it all gets clouded anytime there's an attempt to do something patriotic in those ways. You're Hitler. I mean, and you talk about something that has been used for everything, and still for some reason everybody runs like mad when the name is brought up. And similarly, think about time of Lambeth. I mean, you're right after the First World War, for example, in Germany. you have a host of things going on there that are creating kind of conditions for that odd situation. But the interesting way in which technology gets utilized at this rich advancement. You're talking in Germany. You're talking intellectually, probably probably one of the highest points intellectually. I mean, in terms of philosophy, sciences, and everything else, whatever else they have. And you're talking about in fields of sociology and understanding how civilizations work and how to toy with them and play with them. And then you have, for example, a lot of disillusionment after the First World War with some. I mean, Karl Barth would be an example where all of the liberalism and the theological hopefulness tied to cultural Christianity was split. They lost that kind of naivety. But nevertheless, they were being readied for what was a romantic construct in the name of going back to German virtues. And this is one of the things, this is something I've been coming to more recently, is and I think there is this right move for theological retrieval. We hear it. I think there is, it's like ressourcement. But what the retrievalists in their best and the ressourcement people do not mean is kind of that we can repristinate, that we can all of a sudden go back to Thomas Aquinas or the church fathers and have the same way of articulating those things here and now. We can't have this shared faith and grow from their wisdom, but our conditions are such that they're going to have to be applied and lived out in a very different way. So they are a wisdom bank, and they have resources that have been lost that we can work with. But we can run the risk of idealizing too much and almost using modern technological approaches to plant it down onto reality, when those doctrines are about getting a hold of reality, helping us to see and navigate the right way. They're not simply about trying to force down onto something a world that is not structured for it. And so I think this is what you have with, Germany's attempt to retrieve its glory day was done it was a utilized technology driven by a romanticism detached from the realities, and look at the hell it caused.
I ran into a quote by Tolkien once, just recently, where he was talking about Hitler and how utterly annoyed he was. I mean, at Hitler for a whole lot of different reasons, obviously, but the one that he was commenting on in this particular letter was his use of Norse mythology.
Yeah.
That they want to bring back Odin and all of these. He says, Odin was a failure. Odin, the story is that Odin is defeated.
Right.
In the end. And he says, the Germans trying to grab hold of this as a mark of victory and a mark of all these kinds of things, they're just misreading the myths. Just really annoyed Tolkien.
If listeners don't know what we're referring to, read Ragnarok. Basically what happens is that the good guys die in the end. So it's sort of like John MacArthur, who's famous for saying, we lose down here. Well, for the Norse gods, they lose down here.
Yeah.
So down here and up there and everywhere else.
Everywhere
is really the point. But
yeah. But Ragnarok is sort of the sad ending of everything. It's just everything. Get to your point. That's the weirdness about all of that.
So they didn't even do a good job of retrieval.
Yeah, that's it. But I think that is one of the things that, we can gain a wisdom there, is that for all of the necessities and goods that come out of good retrieval work, it's similar to like being a good historian. You can't just say, oh, the Reformation historically happened because of this, and I'm just going to manufacture that again so that I can have a Reformation again. It doesn't work like that. And so I see these idealized attempts at, for the Reformation, they weren't nominal, and, all these things. It's better just to have to work through these things and use what lessons we can learn from even bad mistakes in the past, and then try to think we can simply retrieve, and that's going to solve all our problems. It's going to require an investment in learning this is what the church has had to do in every age. This is what the Lambeth, for all of its attempts to see it, it failed in this regard. It failed to be able to see here. And that's really where I think a lot of it has to do with formation and immersion in a richer view of Christian understanding of reality. And that is not something you can just go grab a teaching and plant it down onto the world. It has to form you to be able to see it and contribute from it. And that's a long scale discipleship task.
Yeah, about the going back to the Reformation, I did a talk at Coram Deo Church in Bremerton, Washington, a few years back, where it was the topic I was given was post tenebrae lux for a postmodern world. Okay,
Yeah.
and the what I argued in there is that many of the same issues that came up in the Reformation are still relevant today, but from the opposite direction.
Yeah.
So an overly superstitious view of sacraments versus no recognition of sacrament at all.
At all. Yeah.
Those kinds of things. So
Yeah.
I mean, the issues may be the same, but the solution can't be.
Yeah.
So getting to the nature of family life. So one of the things that people today raise as an objection to, say, a large family is the expense. I mean, we have people who objected the expense of one child, let alone, 5 or 6.
Yeah.
So getting to kind of the realities on the ground when it comes to what we're talking about here. So, of course, we're going to have a challenge doctrinally. We're going to have a challenge with helping people understand the nature of the sacraments. But just in the course of our daily lives, living out our convictions and creating, sort of a situation in which, or sort of conditions in which people can actually do what we're talking about. Now, people can do it, but what I'm getting at is this term that Peter Berger talked about, plausibility structures. For a lot of folks, the idea that I could have a large family just does not seem plausible when I can't even afford a house.
And well, that's it. And we have, in the world we live in, created the conditions that makes it very difficult. I mean, this is in a lot of times intentionally so. I mean, look at the grocery prices, right? And not everybody can farm and build their own, get their own chickens and everything. I mean, it's nice to, but not everybody has that thing. So what do they do? My great grandmother, when my great grandfather passed away, had 13 children to raise on a farm by herself.
Right.
They didn't have everything, but they had a lot, and they were able to do a lot. I don't even think people would know how to do that now, but much less would even be able to get those basic resources to do it. And there is a war against doing that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we'll need to do is help churches understand the ways that they can work with people and help them actually live out the convictions that they have. So our situation here in Battleground is pretty, I think, unique in the sense that there's been a very self-conscious effort here to help that happen in lots of ways. So that's just one of the reasons why the median age in our church is like 14 or 15. We've got so many kids. But we also have not just big families. We've got businesses, and the businesses are owned by people who've got a very strong commitment to making this work. So, and the Lord has blessed those businesses in ways that are just hard to fathom and maybe even explain to people. And I don't mean to imply that if you have the right, goals, that everything's going to go well. I mean, there's certain things about what's happened for us that, it's maybe it's one off, but we at least do need to say, as church leaders, yes, these are the things that we as Christians have historically believed, and we still think they're true. And we know that this is really out of sync with our larger culture, but we're going to help. We're going to do what we need to do to help. And we're not going to go to the lowest common denominator all the time and try to in order to reach people.
Yeah.
We're actually going to be, so committed to the way we're doing things that people, when they look in on us from the outside, the thing that they're going to say, they're not going to say, well, you're just like us, just with a Jesus T-shirt. What they'll say is, you are so different.
Yeah.
How is that even possible?
Yeah. Well, but I think you're right on the way in which it goes. It has to go all the way down. It has to be committed to by people of faith, where they really do see that certain lifestyles, like the single lifestyle defined by modern contemporary culture, brought into a marriage, could even become one of the possibilities we should entertain. And I understand. I think you. If I would just hear Lambeth today, of course, I don't want to hear it today, but especially where it is today. But if we were dealing with that question there, probably on this end, we would say one of the biggest things from that they probably had their finger on was the increasing challenge economically that is going to hit by the way the world is moving. And again, there's a lot of layers to that. For all the goods that have come out of certain kinds of global capitalism, all the rest, the way in which the family has wreaked havoc in the local and the community and these kinds of things. And there are all kinds of theories on how to address it. But it is definitely a roadblock for a lot of people to even conceive. I know a lot of young people, some aren't Christian at all, but they don't want to have kids. Some of them have gotten married, but all they want to do is travel with their money. And I understand where that ends up, but that is a easy sell to people because they don't, when they weigh the option of, all this problem and worrying all the time if I'm going to have enough food on the table and everything else compared to, I've got plenty and whatever. They see that it's a wrong option, but they see it as an easy option. And we're cultured technologically to the easy option.
Well, we've done. We've also created a set of, maybe phony crises to justify not having kids. Like, you don't want to increase your carbon footprint, right? Yeah. Anyway, I cut you off, Glenn.
Yeah, I think looking back at this, one of the things we shouldn't underestimate is the impact of feminism.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about it just in terms of raw economics. Let's assume that a high percentage of women enter the workforce, which has happened. Yeah. What happens to wages?
Yeah.
By supply and demand, wages go down. Right. So that when I was a kid, a blue-collar worker could afford a house and have a second vacation house or boat or something like that, and was living effectively debt-free except for the mortgage, and had lots of kids. And they could do that on one salary because the mother stayed home. I would argue that the economic dimensions of women entering the workforce, let alone the sociological dimensions, are one of the reasons why it's really hard to make a living wage now.
Yeah. I think related to that, we're seeing with the birth dearth of kind of slow collapse that is going to take a while to play out. I mean, I think a lot of people know about it, but I don't think anybody feels the panic that, I think people will feel, say, 30 to 40 years from now with what's occurred. Hopefully at that point, people will, question the conventional wisdom of our time, including, dual income and all that kind of stuff. But we're still kind of a ways away from that. We see it. We can intellectually, we can look at the charts, and we can say, oh yeah, this is what's going to happen. But it's kind of like I can't remember where the king of Israel, who it was, who said, well, at least not in my time.
Hezekiah.
Yeah. That's right. Right. That's it. Yeah. So I don't have to worry. I'm going to die, and it'll be after I'm gone.
Well, somebody posted on X about how important it is that we increase the birth rate. And Elon Musk replied, must I do everything?
Well, I think people need to know that Elon didn't do it the old-fashioned way.
Yeah.
11 of his kids are in vitro.
Yeah.
of his 12.
Yeah.
That's astonishing.
And
with
again,
different mothers.
here is a that's a good example of technological man. Utilizing technology, believing in it. His faith is completely in it. He has no problems of doing something like having a bunch of kids with a bunch of mothers and not caring about the ontological bonds that are bound up with the relationships that they've been birthed into. I mean, none of that goes into his equation. It's not going to. And this is the thing. It's sometimes one of the frustrating things is that the attitudes and dispositions, even of people in the church, are so shaped by anti-Christian understandings and metaphysics and forces that even if, the physics of it are going to swing back and people are going to need to have children or their attitudes are going to be readied for it, you still haven't dealt with the kind of the undercurrent and the growth up around it.
Yeah, that's a great point to end on there, Tom.
Yeah,
because we have come to that time.
There we go.
That's right. Anything else you guys want to say before we wrap it up, though?
Quick final comment. One of the things that I think we really need to highlight here is the problem of attempting to buy the culture's respect by compromising with the culture.
Yeah.
All it leads is more capitulation, one after another, until you are indistinguishable from the culture.
That's exactly right.
And that's the problem we've had. And then when we try to resist it, it's already been so absorbed into the culture that we put our affirmation on it that they've run with it.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that's enough for now. Thanks a lot for getting all the way to the end of this episode. And we really appreciate your interest in our show. And hopefully it's been helpful to you. If you would like to support our work, we do have a Patreon page, just like everybody else in the world, apparently. But it does help a lot when people give on an ongoing basis to the work. We have bills to pay. We don't spend a lot of time on the front end pushing for this, like I think a lot of people do. I've listened to other shows where that's like the first 5 minutes is nothing but a fundraiser, and you finally get to the actual content of the show. We do it the other way, and we have a pretty light touch. We trust the Lord will fill our, take care of us and take care of our needs. But you could be a part of that. You could be the person or one of the people that God uses to pay the bills, and if you would consider that, we'd appreciate it. So there's a link in the show notes to our Patreon page. Anyway, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Westminster Presbyterian Church in Battleground, Washington. It is also produced and edited by Wiley Craft Productions of Nashville, Tennessee.